To our amazing viewers at Cheating Tales Lab, we'd love to hear, which part of the world are you joining us from? Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Man Who Built Everything. Salvatore Guerra stood on the balcony of his custom-built mansion, watching the sunrise paint the sprawling estate in golden hues. At 38, he commanded respect wherever he went, not through inherited wealth or political connections, but through sheer force of will and an intelligence that borders on predatory. His construction empire, Guerra Holdings, had risen from a single bulldozer 15 years ago to a multi-million-dollar operation that reshaped skylines across 3 states. The scars on his knuckles told stories of his earlier days, when he'd personally handled workers who thought they could cheat him. The perfectly tailored suit couldn't hide the powerful frame beneath. A man who'd built his first foundation with his own hands and never forgot the lessons concrete and steel had taught him about permanence and pressure points. Elizabeth Randall had caught his attention 12 years ago at a charity gala, not because she was the most beautiful woman in the room, but because she was the only one who didn't immediately fawn over his obvious wealth. She'd challenged his opinions on urban development with sharp intelligence and genuine passion for city planning. She was an architect then, ambitious and brilliant, with designs that caught his eye long before her green eyes did. Their courtship was a clash of titans, 2 strong personalities circling each other like wolves establishing dominance. When she finally accepted his proposal, it felt like victory. Their wedding was featured in 3 magazines, not for its extravagance, but for the power couple it represented. Elizabeth Guerra became his equal partner in public, the sophisticated face of Guerra Holdings' charitable foundation, while Salvatore built their empire brick by brick. 7-year-old Dominic Guerra inherited his father's steel gray eyes and his mother's sharp intellect. The boy had an unsettling ability to read situations with adult-like clarity, often making observations that stopped conversations cold. Salvatore recognized himself in his son's calculating gaze and quiet confidence. While other children played with toys, Dominic studied blueprints and asked pointed questions about leverage and structural integrity. The Guerra family presented a perfect facade to the world. Elizabeth's architectural firm had grown under the umbrella of Guerra Holdings, designing several of their flagship commercial projects. She specialized in sustainable urban housing, a passion project that won her numerous awards and speaking engagements. Their home, a modernist masterpiece she'd designed herself, featured floor-to-ceiling windows that made privacy impossible unless someone wanted to hide something. Salvatore's closest ally was Keith Estes, his head of security and former Marine who'd served 3 tours before joining Guerra Holdings. Keith understood loyalty in absolute terms and had helped Salvatore navigate threats both legal and physical during their rapid expansion. The 2 men shared an unspoken bond forged in mutual respect and tested through years of challenges that would have broken lesser partnerships. But Salvatore's most dangerous asset wasn't Keith's tactical expertise or his own business acumen. It was his memory. He remembered every slight, every betrayal, every moment of disrespect with photographic clarity. He'd built his reputation on keeping his word absolutely, but also on ensuring that those who crossed him regretted it completely. Former competitors who'd tried to undercut his bids found their permits mysteriously delayed, their workers poached, their financing suddenly complicated. He never broke the law, but he bent it until it screamed. The construction industry taught harsh lessons about human nature. Salvatore learned early that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, that every partnership needed insurance, and that information was more valuable than gold. He'd built a network of contacts in city planning, banking, and law enforcement, not through corruption, but through mutual benefit and careful cultivation of respect. This morning, like every morning for 7 years, Elizabeth kissed him goodbye at exactly 7:15 a.m. before heading to her downtown office. Dominic hugged his legs with surprising strength before Mrs. Elena Carr, their housekeeper, walked him to the private school gates. The routine was perfect, predictable, safe. Salvatore Guerra controlled every aspect of his world with mechanical precision. He believed in planning, preparation, and the absolute certainty that success came to those who eliminated variables. He'd built his life like one of his buildings: strong foundation, careful engineering, and redundant safety systems. He had no idea that the very perfection of his control had created the cracks that would soon bring everything crashing down. Chapter 2. Foundations Cracking. The text message arrived at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, while Salvatore reviewed architectural plans for a new casino project in Atlantic City. The number was blocked, but the message was crystal clear. Check the parking garage camera at your wife's building. Level B2, spot 47. Today, last Thursday, and 3 weeks ago. Salvatore stared at his phone screen, his expression unchanged. Keith Estes sat across the conference table, noting the sudden tension in his boss's shoulders. Salvatore had built his empire on information. He understood its power and its danger. Someone was offering him knowledge that could destroy his world, and his first instinct was to trace the source. "Keith, I need you to make a call," Salvatore said quietly, setting his phone aside. "That contact of yours in building security downtown, does he still owe us for the permit issue last year?" Within an hour, Keith returned with a USB drive and a grim expression. "Boss, you're not going to like this." The security footage was damning in its clarity. Elizabeth's silver BMW parked in spot 47, followed minutes later by a black Mustang. Curtis Morrow emerged from the Mustang, tall, lean, with the easy confidence of a man half Salvatore's age. Salvatore recognized him immediately. Elizabeth's project manager from the Sustainable Housing Initiative, the charming architect she'd praised countless times for his innovative approaches and fresh perspective. The timestamp showed 2:15 p.m., exactly when Elizabeth had told him she was in a zoning meeting across town. Salvatore watched his wife and Curtis disappear into the stairwell together, his face expressionless as granite. Keith shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the dangerous stillness that preceded his boss's most devastating decisions. "How long?" Salvatore's voice carried the quiet intensity that made hardened construction workers nervous. Security logs show 3 months of regular meetings. Always the same spot, always the same time slot. Salvatore nodded slowly, his mind already cataloging details. Curtis Morrow was 28, graduated from Penn's architecture program with honors, and had been personally recruited by Elizabeth 18 months ago. His personnel file showed no red flags: good family background, steady employment history, impressive portfolio. But Salvatore hadn't survived in construction by trusting surface appearances. "I want everything on him. Financial records, previous employment, personal connections. Everything." Salvatore's voice carried the mechanical precision he used when ordering concrete pours. "And Keith, this stays between us until I decide otherwise." The drive home that evening felt different. Salvatore noticed details he'd previously overlooked. Elizabeth's new perfume, the way she checked her phone constantly, her sudden interest in late-evening client meetings. The signs had been there, camouflaged by 7 years of trust and routine. Dinner was a masterclass in performance. Elizabeth described her day with practiced detail, mentioning the zoning meeting that never happened with convincing frustration about bureaucratic delays. Dominic observed both parents with those unsettling gray eyes, sensing undercurrents he couldn't yet name. "Daddy," Dominic said during dessert, "why do people lie about where they go?" Elizabeth's fork hesitated for a fraction of a second, barely noticeable unless someone was watching for reactions. Salvatore met his son's gaze with paternal warmth while noting the boy's intuitive grasp of deception. "Sometimes people think lies will protect other people's feelings, son, but lies always make things worse in the end." That night, Salvatore lay awake beside his sleeping wife, studying her face in the moonlight. Elizabeth had always been beautiful, but now he analyzed her features like an opposing attorney examining evidence. The slight smile playing at her lips suggested dreams he no longer shared. Her phone buzzed twice with late-night messages she'd answer tomorrow with rehearsed explanations. Salvatore Guerra had built his fortune by identifying structural weaknesses before they became catastrophic failures. He understood that betrayal, like foundation rot, started small and spread until it compromised everything. The question wasn't whether to act. It was how completely to dismantle what had been built on lies. But first, he needed to understand the full scope of the deception. Curtis Morrow wasn't just sleeping with his wife. He was stealing from the business that had made Elizabeth successful. The sustainable housing project they developed together wasn't just professional collaboration. It was their shared future, funded by Salvatore's money and connections. As Elizabeth shifted in her sleep, mumbling Curtis's name so softly that anyone else would have missed it, Salvatore felt something cold and final settle in his chest. The man who had never forgiven a business rival's minor slight would not forgive this ultimate betrayal. The construction of his revenge would be his masterpiece, carefully planned, expertly executed, and absolutely devastating. Chapter 3: The Officer's Mistake. 3 weeks later, Salvatore sat in his black Escalade outside Dominic's school, watching his son's soccer practice wind down. The evening routine had become precious to him. These moments of genuine connection while his marriage crumbled behind a facade of normalcy. Elizabeth's lies had grown more elaborate, requiring her to be out of town for consulting projects that Keith's investigation proved didn't exist. The anonymous messages had continued, providing detailed information about Curtis and Elizabeth's affair that someone with serious resources was gathering. Salvatore suspected business rivals were trying to destabilize him through personal scandal, but he'd turned their intelligence gathering to his advantage. He now knew about the lakeside cabin Curtis rented for their meetings, the jewelry he'd bought Elizabeth that she claimed were business gifts from clients, and most damaging of all, their plans to leave together after Elizabeth's divorce was finalized. What Elizabeth didn't know was that Salvatore had been documenting everything through legitimate private investigation channels. Keith's contacts in law enforcement had recommended Raymond Mitchell, a former detective whose surveillance work was admissible in court. The evidence file was growing thicker each day, but Salvatore wanted more than a divorce settlement. He wanted complete destruction. Dominic jogged over to the SUV, grass stains on his uniform, and that intense expression that reminded Salvatore why he'd named his son after Saint Dominic, the patron saint of astronomers and people accused of wrong things. The boy possessed an almost supernatural ability to see through pretense and manipulation. "Mom's not coming home tonight, is she?" Dominic asked as he buckled his seatbelt. Salvatore studied his son's face in the rearview mirror. "Why do you say that? She packed different clothes this morning, and she kissed you longer than usual, like she felt guilty about something." The boy's emotional intelligence was frightening. Salvatore wondered how much Dominic had observed that adults dismissed as childish misunderstanding. "Your mother has work obligations that keep her busy. Dad, I know she's lying." Dominic's voice carried a matter-of-fact certainty that sent chills down Salvatore's spine. "I've known for weeks. Curtis calls her when she thinks I'm not listening. She talks to him the way she used to talk to you." The admission hung between them like a confession. Salvatore had underestimated his son's awareness, just as Elizabeth had underestimated Salvatore's investigative capabilities. The entire family was living layers of deception, each thinking they were protecting the others from painful truths. When they arrived home, Elizabeth's BMW wasn't in the driveway. Her hastily written note claimed an emergency client meeting in Philadelphia, but Keith's tracking showed her car heading toward Curtis's lakeside cabin. Salvatore had resisted the temptation to confront them directly. That would come later, when he controlled every variable. The call came at 11:47 p.m. Elizabeth's voice was frantic, claiming car trouble on a dark country road near Allentown. She needed Salvatore to pick her up immediately, couldn't reach roadside assistance, and was frightened by passing truckers who'd offered help. Her performance was excellent, the perfect blend of vulnerability and urgency that would have triggered his protective instincts in earlier times. Salvatore dressed quickly, telling Dominic he'd be back within 2 hours. The drive to Elizabeth's supposed location took 45 minutes through winding back roads that he knew by heart from construction site visits. But instead of finding his stranded wife, he decided to make an unscheduled stop at the Guerra Holdings corporate office downtown to collect documents he'd forgotten for tomorrow's meeting. The parking garage beneath Elizabeth's architectural firm was connected to the Guerra Holdings building through a shared basement level. Salvatore used his access card to check on the sustainable housing project files stored in the joint office space. He had every legal right to be there. His company held a 60% stake in Elizabeth's firm and provided its primary funding. He was photographing contract discrepancies when footsteps echoed in the stairwell. Elizabeth and Curtis emerged from the elevator, clearly having spent the evening together while she claimed to be stranded miles away. They were so absorbed in their intimate conversation that they didn't notice the man standing in the shadows near their shared office. Salvatore stepped into the light just as Elizabeth was unlocking her office door. Working late on the Philadelphia emergency? Elizabeth spun around, her face cycling through shock, fear, and desperate calculation. Curtis stepped protectively in front of her, which was exactly the wrong response when facing a man like Salvatore Guerra. "Mr. Guerra," Curtis said, trying to project confidence he clearly didn't feel. "Elizabeth and I were just reviewing the sustainability project requirements. We had some concerns about the environmental impact assessments that couldn't wait until morning." Salvatore smiled, the cold expression that made construction site foremen check their insurance policies. "Interesting, because my wife called me from Allentown 2 hours ago, claiming her car broke down and begging me to rescue her." The silence stretched until Elizabeth found her voice. "Sal, I can explain." "No explanation necessary." Salvatore's tone was conversational, almost friendly. "I understand completely. You've been working very closely together on this project. Very intimate collaboration." Curtis made the mistake of stepping forward aggressively. "Look, whatever you think you know." He never finished the sentence. Salvatore moved with the economical violence of a man who'd settled disputes with his hands before he could afford lawyers. Curtis hit the concrete wall with a sound like breaking lumber, then slid down to sit in a dazed heap. "Don't." Salvatore's voice stopped Elizabeth from rushing to her lover's aid. "You've made your choices. Now you'll live with the consequences." The police arrived 18 minutes later, responding to a security alarm triggered when Curtis's body hit the wall-mounted panic button. Elizabeth had used those 18 minutes to call 911 and craft a story about her estranged husband attacking her and her colleague during a legitimate business meeting. When officers Terrence Houston and Charles Albright arrived, they found what appeared to be a clear case of domestic violence. A well-dressed businessman standing over a bloodied younger man, while a frightened woman cowered nearby. Elizabeth's performance was flawless, the terrified wife seeking protection from her increasingly unstable husband. "He's been following me," Elizabeth sobbed to Officer Houston. "Sal's been acting paranoid and violent for weeks. He accused me of having an affair and attacked Curtis when he tried to defend me." Salvatore said nothing as they handcuffed him, his expression blank as stone. He'd learned long ago that silence was more powerful than protest when dealing with law enforcement. The officers were professional but firm, treating him like any other domestic violence suspect despite his obvious wealth and influence. The walk to the patrol car felt surreal. Salvatore Guerra, who controlled millions in assets and influenced municipal politics across 3 states, was being arrested based on his cheating wife's lies. But he wasn't angry. Anger was a luxury he couldn't afford when planning required cold calculation. It was then that Dominic appeared. The 7-year-old stood at the edge of the parking garage in his pajamas and sneakers, having somehow made his way downtown in the middle of the night. Mrs. Carr, the housekeeper, stood behind him with a worried expression, clearly having been awakened by the boy's insistence that his father needed help. "Officer Uncle," Dominic said to Officer Houston with that unnerving adult composure. "Check the name on the address plaque of this house." Officer Houston looked confused until he followed the boy's pointing finger to the building directory. There, in brass letters that caught the streetlight, Guerra Holdings, Corporate Headquarters. Salvatore Guerra, CEO. The officer's eyes widened as the implications sank in. The man they'd just arrested owned the building where they'd found him. The crime scene was actually his place of business, where he had every legal right to be at any hour. "Sir, we are extremely sorry," Officer Houston said, moving to uncuff Salvatore immediately. But Salvatore didn't move to accept the apology. He stood perfectly still, studying Elizabeth's face as her carefully constructed story collapsed. Curtis was struggling to his feet, blood from his broken nose staining his designer shirt. The security cameras that Elizabeth had forgotten about were recording everything. "The damage is already done," Salvatore said quietly. "But thank you for the demonstration." He wasn't talking to the police. Chapter 4. The Architect of Vengeance. The arrest had lasted exactly 47 minutes, but its effects would be permanent. Salvatore sat in his home office at 3 a.m., reviewing security footage that painted a very different picture than Elizabeth's police statement. His lawyers would have the domestic violence charges dismissed by noon, but the real victory was psychological. Elizabeth had revealed her willingness to destroy him through false accusations. Dominic's midnight appearance had been calculated brilliance. The boy had awakened to find his mother gone and correctly deduced where the confrontation would occur. His intervention hadn't just embarrassed the police. It had demonstrated the child's loyalty in terms everyone understood. When forced to choose sides, the 7-year-old had chosen his father without hesitation. "How did you know to find me there?" Salvatore asked his son over breakfast. Dominic pushed scrambled eggs around his plate with surgical precision. "Mom always goes to her office when she's upset. And you always check on important things when something feels wrong. The building was the only place you'd both be." Elizabeth hadn't returned home. Her attorney, Stella Yates from Morrison & Associates, had called at 6 a.m. demanding Salvatore submit to psychological evaluation and surrender his concealed carry permit. The legal posturing was predictable. Elizabeth was building a narrative of increasing domestic violence to justify her actions and secure a favorable divorce settlement. But Salvatore had spent 15 years preparing for every type of warfare. His legal team, led by the ruthless Brandon Lindsay, was already documenting Elizabeth's affair through legitimate channels. Private investigator Raymond Mitchell had provided court-admissible evidence of her deception, financial analysis of her unauthorized project expenses, and detailed timelines that proved her systematic lying. The sustainable housing project that Elizabeth and Curtis had been developing was more complicated than simple adultery. They'd been using Guerra Holdings' resources to create something they planned to take with them: architectural designs, environmental impact studies, and municipal connections worth millions in development rights. It wasn't embezzlement in the traditional sense, but it was theft of intellectual property and business opportunities. Keith knocked on the office door with his characteristic two-rap pattern. "Boss, we've got the full background check on Curtis Morrow. It's interesting." The file Keith presented revealed Curtis's carefully hidden desperation. His architectural credentials were legitimate, but his financial situation was catastrophic. Student loans, credit card debt, and a gambling problem he developed during graduate school had left him vulnerable to Elizabeth's recruitment. She'd offered him not just professional opportunity, but financial salvation through their planned venture. "He's been skimming consulting fees through a shell company," Keith continued. "Small amounts, but consistent over 18 months. Elizabeth's been authorizing payments to Morrow Design Solutions for work that doesn't exist." Salvatore studied the financial records with growing satisfaction. Curtis wasn't just an opportunistic lover. He was a thief stealing from the company that employed him. Elizabeth wasn't just an adulteress. She was facilitating fraud against her own husband's business. The moral complexity that might have given him pause had been eliminated by their criminal behavior. The anonymous messages that had started everything arrived with new information. Curtis had been recording his encounters with Elizabeth, possibly for blackmail purposes if their relationship soured. The unknown informant provided locations where Curtis stored insurance against betrayal, including detailed photographs and videos that would destroy Elizabeth's reputation in their social circle. Salvatore's phone buzzed with a call from his mother, Beatrice Guerra, whose social connections made her opinion influential throughout their community. The news of the arrest had spread through their circle with the speed of professional gossip. "Salvatore, I've been hearing disturbing things about Elizabeth," his mother said without preamble. "The Montoya family mentioned seeing her with a younger man at their lake house last month. They thought it might be business, but now—" "Mother, Elizabeth and I are working through some difficulties," Salvatore replied carefully. "I'd appreciate your discretion while we resolve matters privately." "Of course, but you should know that people are talking. The Seymour boy mentioned something about your wife and her employee to his mother. These things have a way of spreading." Salvatore understood the subtext. His mother wasn't just offering information. She was providing early warning about social consequences that could affect Dominic's future. The Guerra name carried weight in their community, but scandal could damage that reputation permanently. That afternoon, Curtis made his first tactical error. He attempted to access the Guerra Holdings server remotely, trying to download files related to the sustainable housing project. The IT security system Keith had installed triggered immediate alerts, and the intrusion attempt was traced to Curtis's personal laptop within minutes. "He's panicking," Keith observed as they reviewed the security logs. "Probably realizes he needs those files if he's going to start his own firm with Elizabeth." Salvatore studied the access logs with cold satisfaction. Curtis had just provided legal justification for a restraining order, termination for cause, and criminal charges for corporate espionage. More importantly, his desperation was forcing mistakes that would accelerate Salvatore's timeline. Set up a meeting with Raymond Mitchell, Salvatore instructed. I want Curtis under complete surveillance starting immediately. And Keith, contact that property management company in Delaware. It's time to acquire some real estate. The pieces of Salvatore's revenge were falling into place with mechanical precision. Curtis and Elizabeth had chosen to fight a war of deception against a man who built his fortune on superior intelligence and careful planning. They'd brought emotion to a strategic battle, which meant they'd already lost. But Salvatore wanted more than victory. He wanted total destruction of everything they tried to steal from him. The sustainable housing project, their shared future, their stolen moment of happiness, all of it would be systematically dismantled and rebuilt to serve his purposes. By evening, Elizabeth had sent messages through her attorney requesting a meeting to discuss our situation like rational adults. Salvatore deleted the messages without responding. He was done with discussion, negotiation, and rational adult behavior. War had been declared, and Salvatore Guerra had never lost a war he'd chosen to fight. Chapter 5. Gathering the Storm. 2 weeks after the arrest, Salvatore had transformed from grieving husband into strategic predator. His downtown office now resembled a military command center, with surveillance photos, financial documents, and legal briefs covering every surface. Raymond Mitchell's investigative reports detailed Curtis and Elizabeth's movements with scientific precision, while Keith coordinated with a network of contacts that stretched from City Hall to construction sites across the region. The sustainable housing project had become Salvatore's weapon. Elizabeth and Curtis believed they were developing it for their future together, unaware that every design they refined was legally owned by Guerra Holdings through contractual agreements Elizabeth had signed years earlier. Their architectural innovations were actually improving a property portfolio that Salvatore was quietly acquiring through shell companies. Curtis had moved into Elizabeth's downtown apartment, believing their love nest was secret. But Salvatore owned the building through a subsidiary acquisition completed the previous month. The penthouse apartment Elizabeth rented was now generating income for her estranged husband while providing him unlimited surveillance access through building security systems. "Boss, we've got a problem," Keith announced, entering with a coffee cup and a grim expression. "Elizabeth's lawyer is filing for emergency custody of Dominic. She's claiming you're mentally unstable and potentially dangerous." Salvatore read Stella Yates's motion with detached interest. Elizabeth was escalating their conflict from financial warfare to biological warfare, using their son as a weapon. The strategy was psychologically sound but legally weak, given the dismissed domestic violence charges and Dominic's obvious preference for his father. "Schedule a meeting with Judge Roman Wall," Salvatore instructed. "His construction contract with us expires next month, and he's been hoping for renewal. Also, contact Dominic's school. I want documentation of every instance where Elizabeth missed conferences, events, or pickups over the past 6 months." The evidence was damning when compiled systematically. Elizabeth's affair had compromised her attention to motherhood in measurable ways. Missed soccer games, forgotten project deadlines, and after-school care extensions painted a picture of maternal neglect that countered her custody claims. But Salvatore's most devastating weapon was Dominic himself. The 7-year-old had inherited his father's strategic mind and his mother's communication skills, making him a formidable witness despite his age. During the court-ordered family evaluation, Dominic answered questions with unsettling clarity about his parents' relationship. "Mom cries at night when she thinks I'm sleeping," Dominic told family therapist Dr. Dana Houston with matter-of-fact precision. "She talks to Curtis on the phone and tells him she wishes Dad would just disappear. But Dad reads me bedtime stories and helps with homework. Dad never lies about where he's going." Dr. Houston's preliminary report recommended maintaining Dominic's primary residence with Salvatore pending further evaluation. The recommendation wasn't legally binding, but it established expert opinion about the family's best interests. Curtis made his second major mistake by attempting to bribe building security guards for information about Salvatore's activities. The guards reported the attempt to Keith immediately, providing recorded conversations where Curtis offered money for anything embarrassing about the crazy husband. The bribery attempt was technically a misdemeanor, but it demonstrated consciousness of guilt and paranoid behavior that undermined his credibility. Elizabeth's financial situation was deteriorating rapidly. Her architectural firm's contracts were tied to Guerra Holdings projects, and Salvatore was systematically redirecting that work to other firms. Legally, he had every right to choose his business partners, but the practical effect was strangling Elizabeth's income while she faced increasing legal expenses. "She's been asking friends for loans," Raymond Mitchell reported during their weekly update. The Donnelly family turned her down after hearing about the arrest. "The Palmers won't return her calls. Word is spreading through your social circle that she initiated the domestic violence complaint falsely." Salvatore's mother had been instrumental in shaping community opinion. Beatrice Guerra's social connections made her an effective ally in controlling narrative, especially among families whose children attended school with Dominic. Elizabeth's reputation was crumbling through whispered conversations at charity events and private dinner parties. But Salvatore wanted more than social exile. He wanted legal consequences. Curtis's corporate espionage attempt had provided grounds for criminal charges, but Salvatore was building towards something more comprehensive. The financial fraud, the intellectual property theft, and the conspiracy to steal business opportunities were federal crimes that could result in prison sentences. The anonymous messages had continued, providing increasingly detailed information about Curtis and Elizabeth's plans. They were preparing to relocate to Seattle, where Curtis had a job offer from a sustainable development firm. Elizabeth planned to file for divorce once she was safely across the country, believing distance would complicate Salvatore's response. "They don't understand who they're fighting," Keith observed as they reviewed the intelligence reports. "They think this is about a marriage falling apart. They don't realize they declared war on someone who doesn't accept defeat." Salvatore's network had expanded beyond construction and law enforcement to include federal investigators interested in the intellectual property theft case. Special Agent Josh Best from the FBI's white-collar crime unit had been briefed on the evidence and was preparing to seek indictments. The federal investigation would make Elizabeth and Curtis's flight to Seattle irrelevant. FBI jurisdiction extended nationwide. Dominic had adapted to the conflict with disturbing ease. The boy seemed to understand that his parents' marriage was ending and had chosen his alliance based on practical considerations rather than emotional attachment. His loyalty to Salvatore was absolute, but it was calculating rather than childish, the loyalty of a future predator recognizing a stronger predator. "When will Mom stop pretending she's coming back?" Dominic asked during dinner, cutting his steak with surgical precision. "Soon," Salvatore replied. "People can only maintain pretense for so long before reality forces honesty." "Good," Dominic said. "I don't like people who lie about important things." The comment sent chills through Salvatore's spine. His son was 7 years old, but he spoke with the moral certainty of someone who'd already learned that betrayal was unforgivable. Elizabeth wasn't just losing her marriage. She was losing her child's respect permanently. As October turned to November, Salvatore's revenge entered its final phase. Curtis and Elizabeth believed they were planning their escape, but they were actually walking into a trap 18 months in the making. Every step they took toward freedom was being monitored, documented, and turned against them. The sustainable housing project they developed together would be built, but it would be built as a testament to Salvatore's victory, not their love. The lakeside cabin where they'd conducted their affair had been purchased by a Guerra Holdings subsidiary. Their dream of starting fresh in Seattle would be destroyed by federal charges that followed them anywhere they ran. Salvatore Guerra had built his empire by understanding that the most effective destruction appeared accidental until it was too late to escape. Elizabeth and Curtis were about to learn that betraying him wasn't just a mistake. It was a death sentence for everything they'd hoped to build together. The storm was gathering, and when it broke, it would wash away everything except the man who'd created it. Chapter 6. The Trap Springs. The first domino fell on November 15th when Curtis attempted to withdraw $47,000 from the Guerra Holdings project account. The account he accessed was actually a honeypot Keith had created, designed to trigger automatic alerts and document attempted theft. Curtis believed he was taking seed money for his Seattle venture, but he was actually providing video evidence of embezzlement that would destroy his life. FBI Special Agent Josh Best arrived at the Guerra Holdings headquarters 30 minutes after the attempted withdrawal, accompanied by financial crimes specialist agent Carla Jones. The evidence Keith presented was overwhelming. 18 months of documented fraud, intellectual property theft, and conspiracy charges that could result in federal prison sentences exceeding 10 years. Mr. Guerra, we appreciate your cooperation in this investigation, Agent Bess said as they reviewed the financial records. Your willingness to serve as a cooperating witness significantly strengthens our case against both defendants. Salvatore nodded gravely, playing the role of victimized businessman seeking justice through proper legal channels. I just want what's mine returned and these criminals held accountable for their actions. The irony was perfect. Elizabeth and Curtis had stolen from the man who would ultimately control their fate through federal prosecutors. Salvatore's cooperation with law enforcement wasn't altruism. It was strategic positioning that allowed him to influence their investigation while maintaining plausible deniability about his motives. Curtis was arrested at Elizabeth's apartment at 6:47 a.m. on November 16th. The FBI's white-collar crime unit executed search warrants simultaneously at 3 locations: Elizabeth's apartment, Curtis's storage unit, and the lakeside cabin where they'd conducted their affair. The evidence seized included laptops, financial documents, and Curtis's insurance videos documenting his encounters with Elizabeth. Elizabeth's arrest followed 3 hours later at her architectural firm's offices. The FBI's public perp walk ensured maximum media coverage, particularly the news footage of Elizabeth crying as she was led away in handcuffs. Salvatore watched the coverage from his office, feeling the cold satisfaction of perfectly executed vengeance. The federal charges were comprehensive: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, theft of intellectual property, money laundering through shell companies, and violations of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Curtis faced additional charges for attempted bribery of building security personnel. Both defendants were looking at prison sentences that would end their careers and destroy any possibility of a future together. Boss, Elizabeth's lawyer wants to negotiate, Heath reported after the arraignments. Stella Yates is claiming her client was manipulated by Curtis and wants to cooperate in exchange for reduced charges. Salvatore smiled coldly. Elizabeth was offering to betray her lover to save herself. Exactly the response he'd anticipated from someone whose word had proven worthless. But he'd prepared for her treachery by ensuring that both defendants were equally culpable in the evidence record. Tell Ms. Yates that the federal prosecutors will consider all cooperation offers, but restitution is non-negotiable. Every dollar stolen must be returned with interest. The financial restitution demands were catastrophic for both defendants. Elizabeth owed $347,000 in misappropriated project funds, plus legal fees and damages that pushed her liability above $500,000. Curtis owed $189,000 plus punitive damages. Neither defendant had sufficient assets to cover their obligations, which meant bankruptcy and financial ruin in addition to prison sentences. Dominic's reaction to his mother's arrest was clinical rather than emotional. The 7-year-old watched the news coverage with the same analytical expression he used when studying chess problems. When the school counselor asked about his feelings, Dominic replied with unsettling clarity, "Mom chose to steal from Dad. Actions have consequences." The custody battle ended before it began. Elizabeth's federal charges eliminated any possibility of gaining custody, and her lawyer withdrew the emergency motion without explanation. Dominic would remain with Salvatore permanently, which was exactly what the boy had wanted from the beginning. But Salvatore's revenge extended beyond legal consequences. The sustainable housing project that Elizabeth and Curtis had developed together became Guerra Holdings' most successful venture, generating millions in revenue while employing their architectural innovations. Every building constructed using their designs bore plaques crediting Guerra Holdings' Sustainable Development Division, ensuring their creative work would always be associated with the man they'd betrayed. The lakeside cabin where they'd conducted their affair was transformed into a corporate retreat center for Guerra Holdings' executive training programs. Salvatore personally supervised the renovation, ensuring that every romantic detail was stripped away and replaced with conference rooms and business facilities. The place where they'd planned their future together became a monument to his victory. Curtis's job offer in Seattle was rescinded when the sustainable development firm learned about his federal charges. Elizabeth's architectural license was suspended pending resolution of the criminal case. Their professional reputations were destroyed completely, making employment in their chosen field impossible even after serving their sentences. The anonymous messages stopped arriving after the arrests, but Salvatore never discovered their source. Someone with serious resources had wanted to destroy Elizabeth and Curtis, using Salvatore as their weapon. He'd been manipulated into seeking revenge, but the manipulation had achieved exactly what he'd wanted: total victory over those who'd betrayed him. 3 weeks before Christmas, Elizabeth sent a letter from Federal Detention Center requesting a prison visit with Dominic. Salvatore read the desperate plea for maternal contact and forwarded it to his attorney without comment. The request was denied on grounds that visitation might be emotionally harmful to the minor child during this difficult period. Elizabeth would serve her sentence knowing that her son was growing up without her, learning to see her as a cautionary example rather than a mother. Her betrayal hadn't just cost her marriage and freedom. It had cost her the love of the child she'd carried for 9 months and raised for 7 years. Curtis received a longer sentence due to his additional charges and lack of cooperation. His gambling debts followed him to federal prison, where creditors garnished his commissary account and made his incarceration even more miserable. The man who'd thought he was stealing another man's wife discovered he'd actually stolen his own future. On Christmas morning, Salvatore and Dominic opened presents in their perfectly decorated living room. Mrs. Carr had prepared a traditional Italian feast, and Keith joined them for dinner, as had become their custom. The Guerra family had been reduced to 3 people, but those 3 were bound by loyalty rather than legal obligation. "Dad," Dominic said as they watched snow fall outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, "will you teach me how to build things the way you do?" Salvatore studied his son's intense gray eyes and recognized himself in that calculating gaze. "I'll teach you everything I know about construction, business, and ensuring that people honor their commitments." The boy nodded with satisfaction. "Good. I want to be able to protect what's important." Salvatore pulled his son closer, feeling the fierce pride of a predator training his successor. Elizabeth and Curtis had thought they were stealing from him, but they'd actually given him something more valuable: absolute clarity about loyalty, betrayal, and the price of crossing a man who never forgot and never forgave. The trap had sprung perfectly, destroying everything his enemies had tried to build while strengthening everything that truly mattered. The price of betrayal had been paid in full. Chapter 7. Breaking Point. 6 months into Elizabeth and Curtis's federal sentences, their lawyers approached Salvatore with an unexpected offer. Curtis was willing to provide testimony against a municipal corruption ring in exchange for reduced prison time, but his cooperation required Elizabeth's corroboration. The federal prosecutors were interested because the corruption involved construction permits and zoning approvals that had cost legitimate businesses millions in delayed projects. Salvatore reviewed the cooperation proposal with cold calculation. Curtis's information could expose competitors who'd bribed city officials for unfair advantages, creating business opportunities for Guerra Holdings while further destroying his enemies' reputations. But cooperation would reduce their sentences, allowing them to rebuild their lives sooner than justice demanded. Deny the cooperation request, Salvatore instructed his attorney. If Curtis has information about municipal corruption, he can provide it without expecting reduced sentences for his own crimes. Brandon Lindsay reviewed the legal implications carefully. "Sal, the federal prosecutors might be willing to make deals with or without your approval. We can't control their charging decisions indefinitely. We don't need to control them indefinitely. We only need to control them until it's too late for mercy." Salvatore's influence with federal prosecutors wasn't based on corruption. It was based on being an exemplary cooperating witness whose information had led to successful convictions. His continued cooperation in related cases made his opinion valuable to agents building their careers on high-profile white-collar prosecutions. The corruption investigation proceeded without Curtis's cooperation, but moved slowly enough to keep both defendants in federal detention for an additional 8 months. By the time they were eligible for reduced sentences, the damage to their lives was irreversible. Elizabeth's architectural firm had been liquidated to pay restitution, with its most valuable contracts transferred to Guerra Holdings subsidiaries. Her professional network had moved on to other partnerships, leaving no place for a convicted felon in an industry that valued reputation above credentials. She would emerge from prison as a middle-aged ex-convict with no career prospects and crushing debt. Curtis faced even bleaker prospects. His gambling addiction had worsened in federal detention, where inmates ran betting pools on everything from weather patterns to commissary prices. He'd accumulated debt to dangerous people who would expect payment regardless of his incarceration. Prison had transformed him from an opportunistic thief into a desperate addict who would never be trustworthy again. But Salvatore's most devastating victory was psychological rather than legal. The videos Curtis had recorded of his encounters with Elizabeth were entered as evidence in the federal case, ensuring their intimate moments became part of the public record. Their love affair, stripped of romance and reduced to criminal evidence, was archived in federal databases where it would remain forever. Dominic, now 8 years old, had adapted to life without his mother with disturbing ease. The boy's emotional development seemed accelerated, as if abandonment had forced premature maturity. He spoke about Elizabeth in past tense, referring to her as my father's first wife, rather than my mother. The psychological severing was complete. Will she try to contact me when she gets out? Dominic asked during one of their evening chess games. Salvatore studied the board, noting his son's improved tactical thinking. People who make fundamental mistakes often repeat them. Your mother's judgment can't be trusted. Then I won't trust it, Dominic replied, moving his queen into position for checkmate. Some mistakes are too big to forgive. The boy's moral certainty was absolute. Betrayal was unforgivable, regardless of biological relationship. Elizabeth had lost her son's love permanently, and no amount of rehabilitation would restore what she'd destroyed through her choices. Keith had been monitoring Elizabeth's prison communications, tracking her desperate attempts to maintain contact with friends and family. The responses were uniformly cold. Their social circle had closed ranks against scandal, protecting their own reputations by shunning the convicted criminals. Elizabeth was experiencing the social death that preceded her actual release. She's been trying to contact your mother, Keith reported. Beatrice has been refusing to accept her calls or visit requests. Salvatore wasn't surprised. His mother understood that loyalty was absolute. Elizabeth's betrayal of her son made her an enemy of the entire Guerra family. There would be no forgiveness, no second chances, no pathway back to respectability. The Sustainable Housing Project had become Guerra Holdings' flagship development, featured in architectural magazines and urban planning conferences as an example of innovative environmental design. The irony was perfect. Elizabeth and Curtis's stolen intellectual property had become Salvatore's greatest business success, generating millions while their names were scrubbed from all credit. As Elizabeth's release date approached, Salvatore implemented the final phase of his revenge. Private investigator Raymond Mitchell had documented every aspect of her prison experience. The friendships formed with other inmates, the rehabilitation programs completed, the counseling sessions attended. The information would be useful for monitoring her activities and predicting her behavior upon release. She's been model prisoner, Mitchell reported. Participated in vocational training, avoided disciplinary incidents, completed substance abuse counseling even though addiction wasn't her primary issue. The prison psychologist recommended her for early release consideration. Salvatore reviewed Elizabeth's prison records with professional interest. She'd used her time productively, preparing for reintegration into society with characteristic intelligence and planning. But intelligence and planning wouldn't overcome the systematic destruction of her life that awaited her release. What about employment prospects? Salvatore asked. Non-existent in architecture. She might qualify for entry-level administrative work, but most employers screen for criminal history. Her federal conviction makes her unemployable in any position requiring trust or responsibility. The economic warfare would continue long after the legal warfare ended. Elizabeth would discover that freedom meant poverty, isolation, and the daily reminder that her choices had consequences she could never escape. Curtis's situation was even more precarious. His gambling debts had grown during incarceration, and creditors were preparing to collect through methods that didn't respect federal prisoner protections. He would leave prison owing money to dangerous people who viewed violence as a reasonable collection strategy. Boss, Keith said during their final planning session, are you sure you want to take this all the way? There are federal laws about harassment of released prisoners. We need to be careful about crossing lines that could create legal problems for us. Salvatore nodded slowly. We're not harassing anyone. We're simply ensuring that natural consequences follow from their choices. The law protects them from illegal retaliation, but it doesn't protect them from the market effects of their reputations. The distinction was crucial. Salvatore would never break the law in pursuit of revenge, but he would use every legal tool available to ensure his enemies never recovered from their self-inflicted wounds. Their punishment would be permanent precisely because it was administered through legitimate channels rather than criminal violence. Elizabeth Guerra had made the mistake of believing she could betray a man like Salvatore without facing complete destruction. She was about to learn that some people never forgive, never forget, and never stop making their enemies pay for their mistakes. Her real sentence was just beginning. Chapter 8. The Ruins of Dreams. Elizabeth's release from federal prison came on a gray February morning after serving 18 months of her sentence. The woman who emerged from the detention center bore little resemblance to the confident architect who'd once graced magazine covers as half of a power couple. Prison had aged her beyond her years, gray streaks in her hair, lines around her eyes, and the defensive posture of someone who'd learned to expect disappointment. No one was waiting for her at the prison gates. Her attorney had arranged transitional housing at a halfway house in South Philadelphia, far from the suburban communities where she'd once been welcome. The bus ride to her new life took 3 hours through neighborhoods she'd previously seen only from highway overpasses. The reality of poverty she'd designed buildings to address, but never experienced personally. Curtis had been released 2 weeks earlier to a different halfway house in Camden, New Jersey. The federal parole system kept convicted co-conspirators separated to prevent coordination of future criminal activity. Their love affair, which had cost them everything, wasn't even allowed to continue during their punishment. Salvatore monitored both releases through legitimate channels, public records, parole officer contacts, and the social services network that tracked released federal prisoners. He maintained professional distance from direct surveillance, but information about their struggles reached him through normal business connections. Elizabeth's first shock came when she attempted to renew her professional licenses. The state architectural board had suspended her certification pending completion of her sentence, but reinstatement required character review and professional recommendation letters. None of her former colleagues would provide references for a convicted felon, regardless of her previous accomplishments. Her second shock came when she searched for employment. The federal conviction appeared on every background check, automatically disqualifying her from any position requiring bonding or security clearance. Architecture firms, construction companies, and design consultancies all maintain policies against hiring convicted felons, especially those convicted of financial crimes. Ms. Guerra, the social worker at her halfway house, explained patiently, "You need to adjust your expectations. Your professional career is over. You need to focus on basic survival, food service, cleaning, entry-level positions that don't require security clearances." Elizabeth stared at the job listings for dishwashers and janitorial staff, unable to reconcile these opportunities with her graduate education and professional achievements. She designed buildings worth millions. Now she was qualified only for minimum wage labor that wouldn't cover her basic expenses, much less her restitution obligations. The financial reality was crushing. Elizabeth owed $547,000 in restitution, legal fees, and damages, debt that accumulated interest during her incarceration and would follow her indefinitely. Her federal parole required monthly payments based on her income, meaning every dollar she earned would be scrutinized and partially seized. She would work for years just to satisfy the interest on her obligations. Dominic, now 9 years old, had grown 3 inches during his mother's absence and developed the confident bearing of his father's protege. When Elizabeth's social worker suggested supervised visitation, the boy's response was clinical. She made her choices. "I don't want to see her." The rejection was absolute and devastating. Elizabeth had lost everything: career, marriage, freedom, and social standing. But losing her son's love was the cruelest consequence. Dominic had moved on psychologically, treating her as a cautionary example rather than a parent deserving affection. Curtis faced even harsher realities. His gambling debts had grown to $73,000 during incarceration, and creditors were pressuring his family for payment. His elderly parents had mortgaged their home to hire his attorney, leaving them financially vulnerable in their retirement. His younger sister had changed her name to distance herself from the scandal, severing family ties permanently. The construction industry's informal network had effectively blacklisted both Elizabeth and Curtis. Word spread through professional associations, trade publications, and contractor networks that the Guerra Holdings betrayers were unemployable. Their reputations preceded them to every job interview, ensuring rejection before they could even present their qualifications. It's not just the conviction, a former colleague explained when Elizabeth begged for any employment opportunity. Sal Guerra has influence with every major contractor in 3 states. Nobody wants to risk business relationships by hiring people who betrayed him. The revelation that Salvatore's influence extended beyond legal consequences into professional exile was devastating. Elizabeth realized she wasn't just competing with other job applicants. She was fighting against the active hostility of the man she'd betrayed. Her employment prospects weren't just limited, they were systematically destroyed. But Salvatore's most sophisticated revenge involved the sustainable housing project itself. The development Elizabeth and Curtis had designed was being built as planned, but with modifications that turned their architectural vision into a monument to their failure. Plaques on every building credited Guerra Holdings' Sustainable Development Division for the innovative design, ensuring their creative work would forever be associated with the man they'd tried to cheat. The project's success made their professional exile more painful. Architecture magazines featured the development in cover stories, praising the innovative environmental solutions and urban planning concepts that Elizabeth and Curtis had created. Their ideas were generating industry recognition and substantial profits. For Salvatore Guerra, he's using our designs to make millions while we can't find work cleaning offices, Curtis complained during one of his rare phone conversations with Elizabeth. Prison had broken his spirit, and freedom offered no hope of redemption. We underestimated him, Elizabeth replied with bitter understanding. He didn't just want us punished, he wanted us erased. The social isolation was as devastating as the financial ruin. Their former friends had moved on, protecting their own reputations by shunning convicted criminals. Wedding invitations stopped arriving, social media connections disappeared, and charity organizations quietly removed their names from donor lists and volunteer rosters. Elizabeth's apartment in the halfway house was a 10 by 12-foot room with institutional furniture and a single window overlooking a parking lot. The woman who'd once designed luxury homes now lived in conditions she'd previously associated with policy discussions about affordable housing. The irony was lost on no one, especially Salvatore Guerra, who received regular updates on her circumstances. By spring, both Elizabeth and Curtis had found employment appropriate to their new station. Elizabeth worked as a night janitor at an office complex, earning minimum wage while scrubbing toilets in buildings inferior to one she'd designed. Curtis worked construction labor for a non-union contractor, performing grunt work on projects that used safety shortcuts he'd once reported to regulatory authorities. Their love affair had become a cautionary tale throughout their industry. Professional conferences included sessions on ethics violations and white-collar crime, using their case as an example of how personal relationships could compromise professional judgment. They'd become anonymous examples of failure rather than recognized individuals with names and reputations. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of their punishment was proximity to their former success. Elizabeth's janitorial route included cleaning the offices of architectural firms that had once competed for her partnership. Curtis's construction work brought him to job sites managed by companies that had previously courted his innovative expertise. They were forced to witness the professional world they'd lost while performing menial labor for people they'd once considered peers. Their punishment wasn't just poverty and isolation. It was a daily reminder of how far they'd fallen and how impossible redemption had become. Salvatore Guerra had achieved perfect revenge. His enemies were alive, aware, and suffering consequences that would last the remainder of their lives. They would never escape the prison of reputation he'd built around them, never recover the relationships they'd sacrificed for their brief affair, and never forgive themselves for underestimating the man they'd tried to destroy. The sustainable housing project was completed on schedule and within budget, generating substantial profits for Guerra Holdings while employing the architectural innovations its creators would never be credited with developing. Elizabeth and Curtis's legacy would be the buildings they designed for the man who'd methodically destroyed their lives. Justice, as Salvatore understood it, had been served completely. Chapter 9. The Final Accounting. 5 years after Elizabeth's release from federal prison, Salvatore Guerra stood in the executive conference room of Guerra Holdings' newest office building, a 30-story testament to sustainable design principles that bore no resemblance to his company's original construction focus. The architectural innovations pioneered by Elizabeth and Curtis had transformed his business empire, generating over $40 million in revenue from projects across the eastern seaboard. Dominic, now 14, stood beside his father studying the architectural models displayed throughout the room. The boy had inherited his mother's spatial intelligence, but channeled it through his father's strategic mindset. His observations about structural integrity and design efficiency impressed visiting engineers who forgot they were speaking with a teenager. The housing project in Baltimore is moving ahead of schedule, Keith reported during their quarterly review. The City Planning Committee approved our modifications to the original environmental impact assessment. We should complete the development 18 months early. Salvatore nodded with satisfaction. The Baltimore project was the 7th sustainable housing development built using Elizabeth and Curtis's stolen intellectual property. Each project carried plaques crediting Guerra Holdings' innovation, ensuring their architectural legacy would forever be associated with the company they'd betrayed. Elizabeth had disappeared 6 months earlier, abandoning her parole obligations and vanishing from the halfway house without explanation. Raymond Mitchell's investigation suggested she'd fled to Mexico, possibly working illegally for cash wages in tourist destinations where background checks weren't standard practice. Her disappearance violated federal parole terms, making her a fugitive subject to immediate arrest upon discovery. Curtis had lasted longer in legitimate society, but suffered a more dramatic collapse. His gambling addiction had intensified during the stress of poverty and social exile, leading to deeper debts with increasingly dangerous creditors. 3 months ago, he'd been found beaten unconscious in an Atlantic City parking garage, his injuries suggesting professional debt collection rather than random violence. Boss, Keith continued, Curtis Morrow died yesterday at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital. Complications from his injuries, brain hemorrhage that the doctors couldn't control. Salvatore processed the information without visible emotion. Curtis's death was a logical endpoint to the trajectory that began when he chose to steal from Guerra Holdings. The man who'd thought he was stealing another man's wife had ultimately stolen his own life through cascading poor decisions that started with betrayal. Arrangements for the funeral? Salvatore asked with professional curiosity. No arrangements. No family claimed the body, and he had no assets to cover burial expenses. The state will handle disposal. The finality was appropriate. Curtis Morrow would be cremated anonymously and buried in a pauper's grave, his existence erased as completely as his professional reputation. The man who'd once designed award-winning buildings would leave no trace of his life except court records documenting his failures. Dominic observed the discussion with analytical interest, processing information about consequences and accountability with disturbing maturity. The boy had learned from his parents' marriage that betrayal was unforgivable and that actions produced results extending far beyond initial intentions. Will you try to find my mother? Dominic asked with clinical curiosity. Salvatore studied his son's expression, noting the emotional distance with which the boy discussed Elizabeth. Do you want her found? No, Dominic replied without hesitation. She made her choices. I'm more interested in learning about the Mexico operations you're considering. The conversation shift demonstrated how completely Dominic had severed emotional connections to his mother. Elizabeth had become irrelevant to his life, less important than business expansion strategies or architectural innovations. Her son had moved beyond forgiveness to complete indifference. Guerra Holdings had evolved from a regional construction company into a sustainable development corporation with international projects under consideration. The intellectual property stolen by Elizabeth and Curtis had provided the foundation for expansion into markets they'd never imagined accessing. Their betrayal had inadvertently given Salvatore the tools for building a global empire. The sustainable housing projects had won numerous industry awards, generating recognition for Guerra Holdings as an innovator in environmental design and urban planning. Salvatore accepted the accolades graciously, never mentioning the origins of his company's architectural expertise. History would record him as a visionary businessman who'd pioneered sustainable construction, erasing Elizabeth and Curtis from their own legacy. "Sir," Keith's assistant announced through the intercom, "there's a call from the FBI. Special Agent Best wants to discuss new information about the Morrow case." Agent Josh Best's update was brief but significant. Curtis's death had triggered investigation into the debt collection assault, leading to arrests of 3 individuals connected to illegal gambling operations. The federal investigation might expose additional financial crimes related to Curtis's desperate attempts to pay his creditors. "Mr. Guerra, we may need your testimony about Curtis Morrow's gambling activities and debt accumulation. Your position as his victim in the original case makes your observations relevant to establishing timeline and motive." Salvatore agreed to cooperate with characteristic civic responsibility. His willingness to assist law enforcement had been consistent throughout the 5-year aftermath of the original crimes, reinforcing his reputation as a legitimate businessman seeking justice through proper channels. The irony was perfect. Salvatore would provide testimony that helped prosecute the criminals who'd killed Curtis, ensuring that even his enemies' deaths served his purposes. Curtis's final contribution to Guerra Holdings would be strengthening Salvatore's relationship with federal law enforcement. That evening, Salvatore and Dominic shared dinner in the mansion's formal dining room, discussing business strategy and architectural innovations with the comfortable familiarity of partners rather than father and son. Mrs. Carr had prepared their traditional Italian meal, maintaining family traditions while adapting to their evolved circumstances. "Dad," Dominic said as they reviewed project proposals, "I've been thinking about the company's succession planning." Salvatore raised an eyebrow at his 14-year-old son's business sophistication. "What conclusions have you reached?" "Guerra Holdings should remain family-controlled indefinitely. Professional management is more efficient, but family ownership ensures long-term thinking and absolute loyalty." The observation demonstrated understanding of business principles that exceeded most MBA graduates' comprehension. Dominic had inherited both parents' intelligence, but channeled it through moral frameworks that prioritized loyalty and accountability above all other considerations. "And how do you ensure absolute loyalty?" Salvatore tested his son's strategic thinking. "By making disloyalty more expensive than loyalty," Dominic replied with cold precision. "People choose based on consequences, not emotions." Salvatore smiled with genuine pride. His son understood the fundamental truth that had built their empire and destroyed their enemies. Consequences were more powerful than compassion, and fear was more reliable than love. As they concluded their evening business discussion, Salvatore reflected on the perfect completeness of his victory. Elizabeth and Curtis had tried to steal his wife, his business, and his future. Instead, they'd given him clarity about human nature, motivation for business expansion, and architectural innovations that transformed his company into an industry leader. Their betrayal had cost them everything while strengthening everything important to him. Elizabeth lived as a fugitive in exile. Curtis died alone and unmourned, and their son viewed them as cautionary examples rather than parents. The sustainable housing projects they developed together were generating millions for the man they'd tried to destroy, ensuring their creative legacy would always serve his interests. Dominic Guerra would inherit an empire built partially on his mother's stolen intellectual property, managed through principles learned from his father's systematic destruction of betrayers. The boy would never make Elizabeth's mistakes because he'd witnessed their consequences from birth. Justice, as Salvatore Guerra understood it, was absolute and permanent. His enemies hadn't just been defeated. They'd been erased, their contributions absorbed into his success, while their names were forgotten by history. The price of betrayal had been paid in full, with interest compounded over 5 years of methodical revenge. Some debts could never be forgiven, and some people never stopped collecting what they were owed. Salvatore Guerra had built his empire on that understanding, and it would endure long after everyone who'd tried to destroy it was forgotten. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.